The letter that changed everything. The year was 2027, and Earth was no longer the same. Ever since humanity's first contact with extraterrestrial life 3 years prior, society had been thrust into a new era of both awe and uncertainty. Towering alien ships, sleek and imposing, hung in the night sky like silent sentinels, visible even from the smallest towns. News networks buzzed with updates about alien trade agreements, cultural exchanges, and an enigmatic initiative called Project Harmony. Mark Taylor, a 30-year-old mechanic from Rockridge, Ohio, was far removed from the intrigue of intergalactic diplomacy. His life revolved around fixing engines, sipping cheap beer, and trying not to think about his failed relationship 2 years ago. His modest life suited him, until the letter arrived. It was an ordinary Tuesday when the envelope showed up at his auto shop. Mark was halfway through replacing the spark plugs on a rusted pickup truck when his boss, a grizzled man named Joe, interrupted him. "Mail came for you, Taylor," Joe said, tossing the envelope onto Mark's workbench. "Looks fancy." Mark glanced at it skeptically. The envelope was heavy, made of high-quality cream-colored paper. A golden seal bearing the emblem of the Department of Extraterrestrial Affairs gleamed in the corner. "What's this? A tax audit from Mars?" Mark muttered under his breath. He left it unopened until later that evening. The revelation. At home, Mark collapsed onto his worn-out recliner, a thrift store find that had become his sanctuary. After heating up a frozen lasagna and absent-mindedly flipping through TV channels, he finally tore open the envelope. The letter inside was printed on the same luxurious paper as the envelope. The words were precise, official, and utterly incomprehensible at first glance. "Dear Mr. Taylor, you have been selected as a participant in Project Harmony, a groundbreaking initiative designed to foster unity between Earth and its extraterrestrial allies. Through an advanced compatibility algorithm, you have been matched with 3 partners from alien civilizations for interspecies marriage. This historic program is essential for strengthening diplomatic ties and ensuring the future prosperity of humanity. Participation is mandatory under Treaty 2067A. Failure to comply will result in significant legal consequences. Congratulations and welcome to the future." Mark's jaw hung open as he read the letter twice, then 3 times. Was this some kind of elaborate prank? The seal on the paper looked official, and the tone of the letter didn't scream practical joke. His doubts began to waver when he Googled Project Harmony. The results confirmed his worst fears. The program was real, and the news outlets were full of stories about it. The initiative aimed to pair humans with aliens to bridge cultural gaps and solidify interstellar alliances. Over 300 humans worldwide had already been selected. Mark's stomach churned as he realized he was one of them. The first contact. The next day at the auto shop, Mark tried to put the letter out of his mind. The rhythmic hum of machinery and the smell of motor oil were his escape. But just as he was finishing up a transmission repair, 2 figures in sleek black suits entered the garage. Their presence was unnervingly out of place in the grimy shop. Mark Taylor, one of them asked. The man was tall, with sharp features and a badge clipped to his lapel that bore the Department of Extraterrestrial Affairs seal. Yeah," Mark stammered. "I'm Agent Davis. This is Agent Wu," the man said, gesturing to his equally intimidating partner. "We're here to discuss your participation in Project Harmony." Mark wiped his greasy hands on a rag, his mind racing. "Look, there's got to be a mistake. I didn't sign up for any." "Participation is not optional, Mr. Taylor," Agent Wu interrupted. Her voice was calm but firm. "Your living arrangements have already been assessed, and your compatibility with your assigned partners has been confirmed. This is a historic opportunity." "Historic opportunity," Mark barked. "You're telling me I'm supposed to marry aliens? I can barely handle my own life." Agent Davis ignored his outburst and handed him a sleek black tablet. On the screen were profiles of his 3 assigned partners. The first was Serafina, a tall, graceful being from the Andariel system, with bioluminescent markings that glowed softly against her pale skin. The second was Kalara, a warrior diplomat from the Martok Empire, with striking crimson eyes and an air of authority. The third was Lyra, a gentle healer from the Zereth Collective, whose shimmering silver hair cascaded like liquid metal. "Your first partner will arrive tomorrow," Agent Wu informed him. "The others will follow shortly after." Mark's head spun. His home, his sanctuary of solitude, was about to become a living experiment in intergalactic diplomacy. A new reality. That night, Mark couldn't sleep. He paced the small confines of his house, his thoughts bouncing between disbelief and panic. How was he supposed to share his life with 3 alien women? What would they even expect of him? He glanced around his bachelor pad, suddenly hyper-aware of its inadequacies. The cluttered coffee table, the peeling wallpaper, the faint smell of motor oil clinging to his clothes. It all seemed embarrassingly unfit for alien dignitaries. When the doorbell rang the next morning, Mark's heart raced. He opened the door to find Serafina standing there, her glowing markings illuminating her serene face. She carried a small, ornately decorated case and radiated an aura of calm that momentarily eased Mark's nerves. "Greetings, Mark Taylor," she said, her voice melodic. "I look forward to understanding your culture and building our partnership." Before Mark could respond, a loud thud came from behind Serafina. He looked past her to see Kalara striding up the driveway, a duffel bag slung over her shoulder. "Let's get one thing straight," Kalara declared, her voice commanding. "I'm here to ensure this alliance succeeds. Don't get in my way." Mark groaned inwardly. This was going to be a long, strange journey. First impressions and unexpected challenges. Mark stood frozen in the doorway, caught between disbelief and dread, as he stared at the 2 alien women now standing in his yard. On one hand, there was Serafina, her calm and glowing presence radiating an almost supernatural sense of peace. On the other, Kalara's imposing demeanor and sharp crimson eyes seemed to radiate an unspoken warning. "Don't mess with me." The awkward silence was broken by the sound of hurried footsteps behind them. A third figure appeared, moving so quietly that Mark almost missed her arrival. Lyra, the Zereth healer, stepped into view, her silver hair shimmering like moonlight. She carried no luggage, only a serene smile that made her seem impossibly out of place in the chaos. "I see we're all here now," Lyra said softly, her voice carrying a soothing tone. "Let's go inside, shall we?" Mark blinked at the absurdity of the situation. Yeah, sure," he mumbled, stepping aside to let them in. His once quiet home now felt uncomfortably small as the 3 alien women filed past him, each bringing an entirely different kind of energy into the space. 3 cultures, 1 house. As soon as they entered, Kalara set her duffel bag down with a thud and immediately began surveying the house. "This will need adjustments," she announced, her voice matter-of-fact. "The living space is cramped, and there's no designated training area." "Training area?" Mark echoed, bewildered. "What are you planning to train for?" "Anything," Kalara replied sharply. "Combat, negotiation, survival tactics. An effective alliance requires preparation." Mark pinched the bridge of his nose. "Great, can't wait." Meanwhile, Serafina had gravitated toward the living room, her glowing fingertips lightly brushing the walls. "This dwelling is quaint," she remarked, her tone neutral but not unkind. "I appreciate its simplicity." "Quaint," Kalara muttered with a smirk. "That's one word for it." Lyra, on the other hand, had made her way to the kitchen, where she was examining a dusty houseplant sitting on the windowsill. "This poor thing needs attention," she said, gently touching its wilted leaves. "It's a wonder it's still alive." Mark let out a humorless laugh. "Welcome to my life." The first conflict. By the time evening rolled around, the house had become a battlefield of clashing personalities. Kalara was already laying down rules, her commanding voice cutting through the small living room like a drill sergeant. "We'll establish a rotation for household responsibilities," she declared. "Mark, you'll be in charge of maintaining supplies. Serafina, you'll handle diplomacy-related tasks. I'll oversee security and training." Serafina raised an elegant eyebrow. "Diplomacy? Are you assigning roles based on stereotypes? That seems reductive." "It's called efficiency," Kalara shot back. "You're the one who glows like a beacon. Use it." Mark tried to intervene. Maybe we don't need a military chain of command in my house." Kalara ignored him. "And Lyra?" She paused, glancing toward the kitchen where Lyra was now brewing something fragrant on the stove. "What are you even doing?" "Creating balance," Lyra replied without turning around. "This space is chaotic. I thought tea might help." "Tea," Kalara repeated flatly. "Wonderful. That'll definitely protect us if we're attacked." "No one is attacking us," Mark snapped, finally losing his patience. "We're in suburban Ohio, not some intergalactic war zone." Kalara narrowed her eyes. "Complacency is the first step toward defeat." Mark threw his hands in the air. "Fine. You want to install a laser turret in the yard. Be my guest." A glimpse of humanity. The tension reached a boiling point when Serafina quietly intervened. "Enough," she said, her voice calm but commanding. "We are here to learn from one another, not tear each other apart." Kalara opened her mouth to argue but hesitated. Something about Serafina's steady gaze seemed to disarm her. Lyra, now carrying a tray of steaming cups, stepped into the room and set the tea on the coffee table. "Perhaps we should start with something simple," Lyra suggested. "Mark, tell us about your world. What is important to your people?" Mark blinked, caught off guard by the question. "What's important?" I guess. Family. Freedom. Hard work." Serafina tilted her head thoughtfully. "Family. A curious concept. In my culture, bonds are formed primarily for mutual advancement, not emotional connection." "That sounds cold," Mark admitted. "Here, family's about taking care of each other, no matter what." Kalara scoffed. "That kind of sentiment makes you vulnerable. Emotional ties can be exploited." Lyra smiled faintly. "Or they can be a source of strength. In my culture, we believe in healing not just the body, but the spirit. Bonds are vital for that." Mark glanced between them, realizing for the first time just how different their perspectives were. And yet there was something oddly fascinating about it. For all their bickering, these women represented worlds and ideas he could barely begin to comprehend. An uneasy truce. As the night wore on, the tension in the house began to ease. Just slightly. Serafina offered to help Mark tidy up, her precise movements making quick work of his cluttered coffee table. Lyra's tea turned out to be surprisingly good, its calming effect noticeable even on Kalara, who eventually stopped pacing long enough to sit down. Mark found himself wondering how he'd ended up here. 3 days ago, his biggest worry had been getting a stubborn carburetor to cooperate. Now he was hosting 3 alien women in his living room, each more complicated than the next. "I don't know how I'm supposed to do this," he admitted aloud, mostly to himself. Serafina glanced at him, her glowing features softening. "One step at a time," she said. "That's all anyone can do." Kalara nodded begrudgingly. "Even in battle, success comes from strategy and patience." "And compassion," Lyra added, her serene smile returning. "Don't forget compassion." Mark sighed, leaning back against the couch. "Well, here's to the weirdest chapter of my life," he muttered, raising his teacup in a mock toast. The 3 women exchanged glances before clinking their cups with his. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The chaos of integration. By the time the sun rose the next day, Mark's home had already begun its transformation, or, depending on how you looked at it, its descent into chaos. The once quiet house now buzzed with activity, each of his alien wives contributing to the commotion in their own distinct ways. Kalara had claimed the garage as her command center, turning it into what looked like the beginnings of a tactical outpost. Maps, charts, and a holographic projector she had apparently smuggled in her duffel bag now dominated the space. Mark could only stare in disbelief as she barked orders at a small floating drone that buzzed around like an obedient dog. "I thought we agreed no turrets," Mark said, leaning against the doorframe. Kaylara didn't look up from her work. "This isn't a turret. It's an automated defense scanner. Completely non-lethal, unless necessary." "Comforting," Mark muttered, walking away before she could explain further. Serafina's mission. Inside, Serafina had taken over the living room. She had somehow managed to transform the space into a makeshift diplomatic chamber, complete with elegant drapery she had fashioned from the old curtains Mark had been meaning to replace. She was now seated cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by holographic displays detailing human cultural practices. This text suggests humans engage in ritualistic bonding activities called barbecues. Serafina mused aloud. "Fascinating. Perhaps we should host one." Mark stopped mid-step. "A barbecue? You mean like burgers and hot dogs?" "Precisely," Serafina said, her glowing fingertips dancing across the holographic display. "It appears to be a tradition that fosters camaraderie and trust." Mark ran a hand through his hair. "Yeah, maybe, but it's not exactly a diplomatic summit. Every connection begins with a single step," Serafina replied, her serene expression making it impossible to argue. Lyra's healing touch. Meanwhile, Lyra had stationed herself in the kitchen, which now smelled like a blend of spices Mark couldn't identify. She had turned his cluttered counters into an organized workspace, where jars of colorful powders and small vials of liquid lined up like soldiers in formation. "What are you making?" Mark asked, cautiously peering over her shoulder. "A restorative brew," Lyra replied without turning around. "Your diet is troubling." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Troubling? You consume far too many processed substances," Lyra said, her voice as calm as ever. "It's no wonder your energy levels are inconsistent." Mark stared at the reheated pizza slice in his hand. "Thanks for the analysis, Doc." Lyra turned to face him, her silver hair shimmering in the sunlight streaming through the window. "I only wish to help," she said softly. "Healing is not just physical. It's also about creating balance in your life." Mark sighed, setting the pizza down. "Fine. Brew away." The first dinner. That evening, the four of them sat down for what could only be described as the most awkward dinner of Mark's life. Lyra had prepared a meal that was, by her standards, nutritionally optimal. Mark wasn't entirely sure what it was, but it smelled earthy and tasted like grass. "This is different," Mark said, forcing a smile. "It's good for you," Lyra replied, her tone leaving no room for debate. Kaylara, meanwhile, had finished her portion in record time. "Efficient and energizing," she declared, "though I'd suggest adding more protein." Serafina, ever the diplomat, took small, polite bites. "It's a unique experience." "Thank you, Lyra." Mark stared at his plate, wondering if there was a polite way to excuse himself and hit up the nearest fast food joint. Building bridges. As the days turned into a week, the initial chaos began to give way to a strange sort of rhythm. Mark found himself learning more about his new companions than he ever thought possible. Kaylara, for all her brusque demeanor, was fiercely loyal. She insisted on running mock emergency drills, which Mark grudgingly participated in, only to realize she had a knack for thinking 3 steps ahead. Serafina, on the other hand, approached every situation with calculated grace. She spent hours studying human behavior, often asking Mark questions that left him questioning his own assumptions about his culture. And Lyra, despite her quiet nature, had a way of bringing a sense of calm to even the tensest moments. Her restorative brews, which Mark had initially resisted, actually started to grow on him, much to his surprise. A glimpse of humanity's strength. One evening, as they sat around the fire pit in the backyard, Serafina's idea for a bonding activity, Mark decided to turn the tables on their endless questions about humanity. "You've all asked me a lot about Earth," he said, leaning back in his chair. "But what do you think of us so far?" Kalara was the first to respond. "You're unpredictable," she admitted. "But that unpredictability is also what makes you formidable. It's a trait many species lack." Serafina nodded. "Your resilience is remarkable. Despite your flaws, you adapt and endure. That is a strength worth cultivating." Lyra smiled faintly. "You possess a spirit of connection. Even in conflict, there is a desire to bridge gaps and find harmony." Mark was taken aback by their answers. For the first time since this whirlwind began, he felt a flicker of something unfamiliar. Pride. "Thanks," he said, his voice softer than usual. "That means a lot." As the fire crackled and the stars blinked overhead, Mark realized something else. For all their differences, these women weren't so different from him. They were just trying to make sense of this strange new world, the same as he was. The unexpected visitor. Mark's tentative sense of balance was shattered early one morning by a sharp knock on the door. It wasn't the polite knock of a neighbor or the familiar rattle of the mail carrier. This was deliberate, urgent, and unsettling. Mark glanced at the clock. 6:13 a.m. Great. Who shows up at this hour? He trudged to the door, still groggy, and opened it to find a figure cloaked in a sleek black uniform. Behind them stood a small, boxy vehicle that hovered just inches off the ground, humming faintly. "I am Commander Elric of the Galactic Accord," the visitor said, his voice clipped and efficient. His skin was a pale shade of gray, with intricate tattoos that glowed faintly along his temples. "I need to speak with your household." Mark blinked. "But come again." "I'm here to evaluate the integration process of your assigned unit under Project Harmony," Commander Elric continued, his tone making it clear this wasn't a request. "May I come in?" Before Mark could answer, Kalara's voice cut through the doorway like a blade. "Evaluation. By whose authority?" Mark turned to see her standing behind him, arms crossed and eyes narrowed. She was still in her sleepwear, a loose-fitting military-style tunic, but she carried herself as though she were fully armed and ready for battle. "By the authority of the Galactic Accord," Elric replied evenly, unfazed by her hostility. "The success of this program is critical to interstellar relations. Regular assessments are non-negotiable." Tensions rise. Within minutes, the entire household was gathered in the living room. Serafina sat gracefully on the edge of the couch, her glowing fingertips resting lightly on her lap. Lyra perched on a chair, her serene expression betraying only the faintest hint of curiosity. Kalara, however, remained standing, her arms still crossed and her posture tense. Mark, slouched awkwardly in his recliner, felt like a kid being scolded by a principal. "So, what does this evaluation involve?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "Observation," Elric replied, pulling a sleek device from his belt. The device emitted a soft hum as it activated, projecting a series of holographic panels into the air. "I will assess your interpersonal dynamics, cultural exchanges, and overall adaptability as a unit. This will determine the program's viability." "Sounds invasive," Mark muttered under his breath. Kalara shot him a glare. "We have nothing to hide." "Yet," Elric countered, his gaze sharp. "But let us begin." The first test. The first part of the evaluation was surprisingly mundane. A simulated task designed to measure their ability to cooperate. Elric placed a cube-shaped device on the coffee table, its smooth surface glowing faintly. "This is a neural harmonizer," he explained. "It generates a series of challenges that require collaboration to solve. You must complete 3 tasks within the time limit." "Piece of cake," Mark said, though his confidence wavered as the device began to hum and emit a soft blue light. The first challenge appeared as a holographic projection, a complex, shifting maze. They were tasked with guiding a glowing sphere through the maze using only verbal instructions. "Left," Kaylura barked immediately, her military instincts kicking in. No, wait. Right. Serafina countered, her analytical mind spotting a faster route. Mark groaned. Can we pick one direction before the timer runs out? Lyra's calm voice cut through the chaos. If we pause and observe the pattern, the maze shifts every 3 seconds. Timing is key. Following Lyra's advice, they managed to complete the maze with just seconds to spare. Mark couldn't help but feel a small surge of pride. Maybe they weren't completely hopeless after all. Uncovering fractures. The second challenge was far less straightforward. The device projected a series of ethical dilemmas, each more complex than the last. The goal was to reach a unanimous decision. One scenario involved allocating scarce medical resources during a planetary disaster. Kaylura immediately proposed a triage system prioritizing those most likely to survive. Efficiency is the only logical approach, she argued. Serafina, however, disagreed. Every life is valuable. Compassion must guide our choices. Lyra added her perspective. A balance between logic and compassion is possible. We should prioritize healing without sacrificing efficiency. Mark, overwhelmed by the weight of the scenario, finally spoke up. Can't we just focus on prevention instead of picking who gets to live or die? His suggestion earned a surprised look from everyone, even Elric. Interesting, the commander said, making a note on his holographic pad. The challenge highlighted their differences, but also revealed something deeper. Each of them, in their own way, valued life. Despite their arguments, they found common ground in their shared determination to do what was right. An unlikely revelation. The final challenge was personal. The harmonizer projected a question directly to Mark. What do you value most in a partner? The room fell silent as everyone turned to him. Mark hesitated, feeling the weight of their expectant gazes. I guess. Trust, he said finally. If you can't trust someone, nothing else really matters. The harmonizer's glow shifted, signaling the end of the exercise. Elric studied them silently for a moment before speaking. You are more cohesive than I expected, he admitted, but there is still much work to be done. Kaylura smirked. We thrive under pressure. Serafina tilted her head thoughtfully. The challenges revealed strengths we did not realize we shared. Lyra smiled faintly. It seems even chaos has its harmony. The verdict. As Elric prepared to leave, he turned to Mark. You're an unconventional choice for this program, he said bluntly. But perhaps that is precisely what makes this arrangement work. Humanity's unpredictability is both your greatest strength and your greatest challenge. Mark shrugged. I'll take that as a compliment, I think. As the commander's vehicle disappeared into the distance, Mark felt an unexpected sense of accomplishment. Despite the awkwardness, the arguments, and the absurdity of it all, they had managed to come together as a unit. For the first time, Mark allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could make this work. A rift in the alliance, the harmony that Mark had started to feel in his home didn't last long. By the end of the week, the fragile peace unraveled when Kaylura's rigorous preparedness training clashed head-on with Serafina's cultural diplomacy efforts. It all started when Kaylura decided to drill emergency protocols. Without warning, she set off a high-pitched alarm she'd rigged in the garage. Mark had been in the kitchen, halfway through a cup of Lyra's latest herbal concoction, when the sound nearly made him spill it all over himself. What now? Mark shouted, rushing into the living room. Kaylura stood in the center of the chaos, barking orders. Serafina, secure the perimeter. Lyra, initiate first response measures. Serafina looked up from her holographic research with an exasperated sigh. Kaylura, this is unnecessary. There is no imminent threat. Exactly, Kaylura replied, unfazed. And that's when we're most vulnerable. Mark groaned. We talked about this. No surprise alarms in the house. Diplomacy versus discipline. Things escalated when Kaylura's militaristic tendencies began interfering with Serafina's carefully planned social initiatives. Serafina had arranged a virtual meeting with a group of alien diplomats to discuss cultural exchanges. She'd even coached Mark on proper etiquette, which mostly involved him keeping his mouth shut and nodding at the right moments. As the meeting began, Kaylura barged into the room, dressed in full combat gear. "Your defenses are inadequate," she declared loudly, startling everyone on the call. "This dwelling is a sitting target." Serafina shot her a withering glare. "Kaylura, this is a diplomatic discussion. Kindly remove yourself if you cannot contribute constructively." Kaylura crossed her arms. "Security is constructive. Not when you disrupt a negotiation." Serafina snapped, her usually calm demeanor fracturing. Mark sat frozen, caught between the two of them. Lyra, sensing the tension, quietly handed him a cup of tea. "Drink this," she said softly. "It's calming." "I think I'm gonna need something stronger," Mark muttered. Lyra's quiet mediation. Later that evening, Mark found Lyra in the backyard, tending to the small herb garden she had started. Her silver hair shimmered in the moonlight, and her movements were slow and deliberate as she transplanted a sprig of something green into the soil. "Got a minute?" Mark asked, leaning against the porch railing. Lyra nodded without looking up. "Of course." Mark hesitated, then sighed. "I don't know how to deal with them. Kaylura's turning the house into a boot camp, and Serafina's about ready to declare war on her." Lyra's lips curved into a faint smile. "Conflict is a natural part of growth. Even the strongest bonds are forged through tension." "Yeah, well, I think they're about to break the forge," Mark grumbled. Lyra finally looked up, her calm eyes meeting his. "Have you told them how you feel?" Mark blinked. "Me? No. They're the ones causing the chaos." Lyra stood, brushing the dirt from her hands. "You are part of this partnership too, Mark. Sometimes the most important step toward harmony is simply speaking your truth." The breaking point. The breaking point came the next day when Kaylura decided to install motion sensor alarms around the property. As she hammered one into the side of the house, Serafina appeared in the doorway, her glowing fingertips shimmering with restrained anger. "Kaylura, what are you doing now?" she demanded. "Ensuring our safety," Kaylura replied without turning around. "You're welcome. This is not your decision to make alone." Serafina shot back. "We are a partnership, not a dictatorship." Mark arrived just in time to see Kaylura drop the hammer and turn to face Serafina, her crimson eyes blazing. "A partnership only works if everyone pulls their weight. You're too focused on appearances to see the real dangers, and you're so obsessed with control that you're blind to the importance of connection." Serafina countered. "Enough." Mark's voice cut through the tension like a knife. Both women turned to him, surprised. Mark took a deep breath, his frustration boiling over. "You two are so busy fighting each other that you're forgetting why we're here in the first place. We're supposed to be building something together, not tearing each other apart." Kaylura crossed her arms, her expression hard. "Then tell me, Mark, what's your solution?" Mark hesitated, then glanced toward Lyra, who was watching silently from the garden. Her serene presence gave him the courage to speak. "We need balance," he said firmly. "We can't let fear or pride drive everything we do. Kaylura, your preparedness is important, but so is Serafina's diplomacy. We need both to make this work." A fragile truce. The silence that followed was heavy, but slowly Kaylura uncrossed her arms. "Fine," she said gruffly. "But if this goes south, don't say I didn't warn you." Serafina's glow softened, and she inclined her head slightly. "I suppose compromise is a strength in itself." Mark let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Good. Now can we please take down the alarm by my bedroom window? It keeps going off every time a squirrel runs by." Kaylura smirked. "No promises." The spark of understanding. That night, the four of them sat around the dining table, sharing a meal that Lyra had prepared. It wasn't perfect. Kaylura still grumbled about the lack of meat, and Serafina critiqued the presentation. But for the first time, There was a sense of tentative understanding between them. Mark raised his glass, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Here's to figuring this mess out, one disaster at a time. Kalara snorted. That's the most accurate toast I've ever heard. Serafina chuckled softly. Agreed. Lyra raised her own glass, her smile calm and steady, to harmony, however imperfect. As the glasses clinked together, Mark felt a flicker of hope. They might not have it all figured out yet, but at least they were starting to move in the right direction. The trial of unity. The fragile peace in Mark's house was tested when they received an unexpected message from the Galactic Accord Council. The holographic communique shimmered to life in the middle of the living room, the voice of an alien official crisp and authoritative. Mark Taylor and household. Your unit has been selected to participate in a public demonstration of Project Harmony's effectiveness. You will present your integration progress to the Galactic Accord Summit in 3 days. Mark's jaw dropped. A public demonstration. Are they serious? Kalara's expression hardened. This is no coincidence. They're testing us. Testing? Serafina said, frowning. This is an opportunity to showcase our unity. Lyra remained silent, her serene gaze fixed on the flickering hologram. Unity cannot be fabricated, she said softly. If we are not aligned, it will show. Mark groaned, slumping onto the couch. Great. 3 days to figure out how to look like we got it together when we're barely holding on. Preparation or chaos. The next morning, the house became a whirlwind of activity. Kalara, predictably, took charge of logistics. She mapped out a detailed schedule of mock drills, rehearsal scenarios, and what she called contingency protocols. We need to be ready for anything, she barked, pacing the living room. Mark, you'll focus on presenting human resilience. Serafina, diplomacy is your role. Lyra. Enough, Serafina interjected. This is not a battle plan, Kalara. It is a demonstration of cooperation. Which will fail if we're not prepared, Kalara snapped. Mark threw up his hands. Can we take a breath? This is supposed to be about showing how we work together, not scaring everyone into thinking we're about to invade. Lyra glanced at him, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Perhaps we should focus on what unites us rather than what divides us. The practice session. The first rehearsal was nothing short of disastrous. Mark struggled to deliver his lines about human adaptability without sounding like a bad infomercial. Serafina's attempts at demonstrating diplomatic prowess were interrupted when Kalara began critiquing her lack of tactical awareness. Lyra tried to mediate, but her calm suggestions were drowned out by the rising tension. By the end of the session, Mark was rubbing his temples in frustration. We're going to crash and burn, aren't we? Kalara scowled. Not if you stop fumbling every other word. Maybe if you weren't barking orders every 5 seconds, I wouldn't be so distracted. Mark shot back. Serafina sighed, her glow dimming. This is counterproductive. Lyra's voice, as calm as ever, broke through the noise. Perhaps we are overcomplicating things. What if we focused on authenticity rather than perfection? The room fell silent, her words sinking in. A different approach. Taking Lyra's advice, they scrapped Kalara's rigid schedule and started fresh. Instead of trying to stage a flawless performance, they focused on what they did best as individuals. Kalara demonstrated her military precision by setting up a mock crisis scenario. Serafina used her diplomatic skills to navigate the conflict, finding compromises even when Kalara resisted. Lyra worked quietly in the background, ensuring everyone remained calm and focused. And Mark, surprisingly, found his stride by simply being himself, offering human humor and ingenuity to solve problems. By the second day, there was a noticeable shift in the group's dynamic. They weren't perfect, but they were learning to play to each other's strengths. The day of the summit. The Galactic Accord Summit was held in a sprawling dome chamber on a space station orbiting Earth. Alien delegates from dozens of civilizations filled the room, their forms and features as diverse as the stars themselves. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation as Mark and his household stepped onto the platform at the center. A holographic announcer introduced them. Representing Earth in the Project Harmony initiative, we present Mark Taylor and his interspecies household. Mark swallowed hard, glancing at the crowd. The sheer number of eyes, some glowing, some multifaceted, trained on him was overwhelming. Serafina stepped forward first, her voice steady and confident. She spoke of the challenges they'd faced and the lessons they'd learned about cooperation and compromise. Her glowing fingertips moved in subtle gestures, emphasizing her words. Kalara followed, her tone sharp but sincere. She described the importance of preparation and the strength found in unity under pressure. Her commanding presence seemed to captivate even the most skeptical delegates. Lyra's contribution was quieter, but no less impactful. She spoke of balance, of the need for empathy and understanding in forging true connections. Her soothing voice seemed to calm the entire chamber. Finally, it was Mark's turn. He took a deep breath, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "I'm not gonna lie," he began, his voice wavering slightly. "When this all started, I didn't think we'd make it. We're so different. Sometimes it feels like we're from entirely different galaxies. But the thing is, those differences are what make us stronger. We don't always agree, but we figure it out. And if we can do it, maybe there's hope for the rest of us, human and alien alike." The room was silent for a moment, then erupted into applause. Or at least, what Mark assumed was applause. Some delegates clapped, others emitted rhythmic vibrations or flashes of light. A new beginning. As they left the summit, Mark felt a strange sense of pride. They'd done it, not perfectly, but together. Kalara smirked, her crimson eyes gleaming. Not bad for a mechanic. Serafina's glow brightened as she nodded. It was a success because we trusted each other. Lyra smiled softly, and because we found harmony in our differences. Mark grinned. "Yeah, let's not make this a habit, though. Public speaking isn't exactly my thing." As they walked toward their transport, the stars visible through the station's massive windows, Mark couldn't help but feel like they'd accomplished something bigger than themselves. For all their flaws and fights, they were a team now. A strange, chaotic, wonderful team.